guys, how are you? Thank you so much for coming down today. Welcome to Happier at Work with the wonderful Aoife O Brien, who we'll introduce in a minute. Hi, Aoife. Thanks a million for coming down. I appreciate this evening is free, but you're paying with your time and paying with your attention, and there isn't a whole lot more valuable out there, in my opinion. I think I'll get a lot out of tonight. Aoife is an excellent speaker in my experience, so hopefully you'll enjoy it. So just to introduce myself before we begin, my name is Jayson. I am a psychologist and I run the Meetup. So what I'm all about really is the psychology of performance and productivity, personal and professional development, and happiness and well-being. I do one-to-one work and workshops and well-being and development programs. I'll share some links for all that with Aoife's links in a minute. But I suppose the whole point of that, that is kind of what underlies this Meetup. So what we're all about here is about helping people move forward and increase their well-being as well, and increase their positive impact. And to do that, we're all about increasing your effectiveness. So we tend to have talks in kind of three main areas based around that. So the first area is all about helping you to better understand yourself. So for example, we did a recent talk on happiness. Another area we tend to focus on is understanding where it is that you want to go. So we had a recent talk on finding meaning and purpose, for example. And then finally, we have talks around kind of overcoming those psychological barriers to you getting there. So those barriers can be both practical and psychological in nature. And examples of that, we've had recent talks on procrastination or battling the inner critic. So the next talk for the Meetup is on October 7th. It's actually myself, and it's in conjunction with Iconic Offices. And it's maintaining a healthy headspace in work, strategies for the new normal to deal with pessimism, other people, and negative self-talk. So again, I'll share a link for all this in just a second. Just to introduce tonight's speaker then, I suppose. Tonight's speaker is the wonderful Aoife O Brien. So Aoife's original background is in the corporate world. She's worked with some of the world's best known brands like Coca-Cola, Unilever, Heinz, and I suppose her original background was in marketing through data analytics. But her passion now is all about happiness at work, more specifically around helping organizations attract and keep star employees by creating environments or cultures that help individuals reach their full potential and businesses thrive. And she tends to achieve this through data-driven decisions and a focus on values, needs, and strengths. So in line with that, Aoife will be talking tonight about happiness at work and how a knowledge of our values, strengths, and needs can help us get the most out of our work lives. So personally, I'm really looking forward to tonight. Aoife has featured in the media, on numerous podcasts. She's done a number of keynote speeches speaking about culture and fit, and as well as things like Imposter Syndrome, which I'm sure she'll mention later as well. Her podcast, Happier at Work, has over 25,000 listens, actually over 26,000 listens in more than 50 countries, and she has literally interviewed hundreds of the world's top professionals on this topic. So really looking forward to it. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to the wonderful Aoife. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jayson, for that lovely introduction. Let me just start sharing my screen here. And here we go. So unless I hear any complaints, I'll assume that you guys can see what I am going to be talking about. Thank you so much, Jayson, for that lovely introduction. I really, really appreciate that. And yeah, we're here today to talk about how to be happier at work. There's me. If anyone would like to connect with me, you're absolutely welcome to do so. They are my social links. If anyone wants to connect or follow, I'm always open to connecting with people, especially on LinkedIn, Instagram. They'd be the kind of two most that I would use. And as Jayson mentioned, I have my podcast, which is called Happier at Work. And I'm happy to share the deck afterwards, so you'll have all of the links there to access it. But search for it anywhere you listen to podcasts and you will find that. I suppose to build on what Jayson said about my background, the reason that I'm interested in all of this idea around being happier at work was because I myself experienced being unhappy at work. And for that reason, it's something I'm really passionate about. So my background is in market research in the fast-moving consumer goods industry. I worked in that for 17 years, and I experienced various different things like being passed over for promotion, not really working to my full potential, having good bosses, bad bosses, really bad leadership, all of those kind of things. And it's a problem that I suppose I've been thinking about how to solve it for the last 10 years or so. And I left my corporate role 3 years ago. I started a master's in organizational behavior, and I became obsessed with this idea of fit and what it means to fit in at work. And by that, I mean like this sense of belonging at work, as opposed to having to mold yourself to fit into an environment that is not really suited to you. So that's the basis for what I'm going to talk about this evening, is all based on the research that I did for my master's dissertation around this concept of fit and how it leads to job satisfaction and happiness at work, and how when we're happy at work, we're actually happier in other parts of our lives, because we spend so much of our time at work that it kind of trickles into the other areas of our lives as well. So I suppose it's about being aware of that. So what we're going to talk about this evening is, and I do have a poll before we're going to start, and I'll ask Jayson to stick that into the chat in just a second. But we're going to talk about like thinking about why you're staying where you are. And then I'm going to talk about the 3 very specific ways to be happier at work, focusing on strengths, values, and I'm going to spend most of the time on needs, because our strengths and our values tend to be very unique, but when it comes to needs, we can clearly define what needs are being met or what needs are not being met, and they're a bit easier and a bit more robust to talk about. There will be time at the end for some questions, and then I will leave you with some more information about how to connect with me as well at the end. So if you have your phone handy, and if you're anything like me, you might have your phone handy, you can just scan that QR code and it will take you to a Menti page where you can vote on how happy you are at work right now on a number 1 to 10. And Jayson, if you could pop into the chat the link to that Menti as well. And if those 2 methods aren't working for people, I'll flick back to that in a second if people need it. But the other thing that you can do is to, now I can't see that because I'm sharing my screen. For some reason, I can't see that. But go to menti.com and type in that number. So if anyone is having any issues with any of those ways to get onto the Menti, do let me know, pop it into the chat, and I'll flick back if I need to, but I can share the live results. That's what I really love to do, is share the live results as they come in. So let me just head on over. So these are the live results of what people are saying about how happy they are at work. On average, 5.2. It's not brilliant, and 17 people have voted already. So there's still a few more votes to come in. Still at 5.2. And one person, it looks like, went for 1 or 2, which is not great. And the numbers are going down, which is also not a great sign. So we're going from 5.2 back down to 4.9. Jayson, I see there's a couple of points coming in the chat. I'm just wondering, can everyone access the Menti okay?
Seems to be fine, Aoife, from what I can gather. The Great. QR code definitely worked for me, and a couple of the guys in the chat are saying it's all good. Perfect. So we'll leave it at that anyway. So 4.9 is the result so far of like what are people's average happiness levels at work. With a few people, it looks like, you know, the majority say, let's say 6, and then a lot of them is below 5. So let me flick back to this presentation deck. The other question I have then, I suppose, that I want to pose is, if you're not happy at work, and it sounds like there's a lot of people who are not really that happy, like what's driving you to stay where you are currently? And there's a few different reasons for that. So I didn't necessarily include this in the research that I did, but it's something that came up when I was doing my reading and research prior to starting my dissertation. So there's 3 reasons why you might stay in an organization, for example. So the first one is affective commitment. So these are all 3 types of commitment. Affective commitment is really, so what you think about your job is, this is a really great place to work.
It's where I feel like a valued employee, and there's a certain emotional connection that you have. You just think it's a really great place. Um, and that's the kind of commitment that you want, is this affective commitment. That's the way you want to feel about work. Then there's continuous commitment. And continuous commitment is you don't feel like you have a choice, because if you left that job, you might not get the same salary somewhere else, or it might not be, might not be able to have the same location or the same standard of living. So it's kind of out of fear that you're staying in your current role, because you're afraid that you might not get the same type of benefits elsewhere. Then there's normative commitment. And this is a sense of obligation. So you feel like you should stay there. They've done something for you. They've invested time, energy, or money. Or one example would be if your organization has paid for your studies, for example. So you feel obliged, like, oh, I really should stay here because they've been so good to me over the years. But it still lacks that sort of emotional connection as well. I do have another poll associated with this. So let me just see if I can get that going. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just see if I can get that going. And okay, is that popping up yet on people's Menti? If you use the same Menti, you should be able to. Can people see that new question on their Menti? Yeah, okay, it's starting to pop through for people. So let me start sharing my screen again. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of people already saying that they're actually not planning to stay in their organizations. I'm always really curious about that, because I left two places pretty much that were just completely toxic. And, I didn't necessarily have to stay, but, other people in the same circumstances may have stayed a little bit longer. I've got 14% that have the affective commitment. Now, remember, affective commitment is that emotional feeling that you get like it's a really, really great place to work. And a lot of people then with that continuous commitment, which is like you're kind of afraid to go somewhere else. So we've got 17 votes through. I'll give it another couple of minutes. I think we had 22 in the last one. But still 25% of people saying that they don't want to stay. It's a really high number. Okay, so there's 20 people voted for that, and I think time to move on, and I'm going to talk about how to be happier at work. So, as Jayson mentioned in the introduction, the focus of my research is all around strengths, needs, and values. It's this concept of fit and how we fit into the environment that we're in. And I had a look at that from the perspective of what it means for engagement, what it means for job satisfaction, and how it can be explained by needs and how our needs are being satisfied at work. And oftentimes, when we think about fitting in or belonging at work, and thinking about like when you see a job ad, when you get a promotion, or when you see someone else getting a promotion, it's very much focused on this idea of strengths or people's abilities or their performance to date. And it's very much focused on that. But actually, what the research shows is the more important elements are this sense of values. So your core values and how you demonstrate your values, and whether or not you feel your values are aligned with those of the organization. And also your values can be you can feel like your values are more aligned with the organization when your needs are being satisfied at work. You feel this greater sense of belonging there. So they're the three kind of topics that I'm going to talk about. They're all color coded. So I'm going to first of all talk about strengths, then values, and then I'm going to finish off by talking about needs, because there's much more kind of to talk about on needs, because it's our strengths and our values tend to be a little bit more unique. So when it comes to our strengths, I suppose maybe the first question is like, do you know what your strengths actually are? Have you given it a lot of thought? What are you better at than others around you? So what do people comment saying like you're actually really good at that? You might not realize. And certainly for me, something I didn't know I was good at was having conversations on the podcast and being able to listen and summarize the points that people were trying to make and really communicate in that way. I had no idea that that was something I was good at. It was, and I don't know whether it's something I developed over time or something that I just naturally had, but a lot of people have commented on that, which I thought was quite interesting. When you think about all of the things that you're good at, what's the thing that you're really best at? So of all the things that of all the strengths that you have, what are you really, really best at? And then think about like, what is your zone of genius? So what is the thing that you can do that no one else can do as well as you can? So thinking about all of those different elements, like, do you actually know what those are? Now, in the deck, and I'm not kind of sharing them live, but in the deck, and Jayson can share this deck afterwards, there is links to some resources that you can use to understand what your strengths are. So if you don't know what your strengths are, or if you'd like a different perspective or using different kind of tools to find out what your strengths are, then there are links to get those tools embedded in the deck so you can have a look at those. They're hidden from this, but when I send it out to Jayson, you'll be able to access those then. The other thing to consider when you're thinking about your strengths is how much do I get to use my strengths in my current role? And if I think about my most recent corporate role, I made a conscious decision to take the role that I was in. There was a choice of working in a team where I really, really would work to my strengths, and an option to be on the leadership team in an area I had less interest in, probably less of an opportunity to work on my strengths. And I decided to go for the latter because, probably out of ego reasons, I was like, oh, you know, I want to feel like I'm progressing in this. I didn't want to report into someone in the leadership team. I wanted to be on the leadership team. And so I took that role, but it became apparent over time that I really wasn't working to my strengths. I had built up all of these great strengths over time, like with data analysis, working with clients, and I didn't have the opportunity to utilize those in my role, in the role that I was in. So some considerations to have then: how much do you actually get to use your strengths in your current role? And I suppose this perspective is about how I ran a poll on LinkedIn a few weeks ago asking people how much they felt they were reaching their full potential in their current role. And I think about 75% of people, of like 100 and something people, were saying that they didn't have the opportunity to really maximize their potential in their current role. And I think like that's one of the reasons that I set up in business, was to help people to maximize their potential, both from the organizational perspective and also from the individual perspective. So that is one key consideration: is how much do you get to use your strengths in your current role? Also thinking about developing your strengths. So I'm sure you'll know this if you've studied any sort of psychology, and specifically positive psychology. It's not about mitigating our weaknesses or developing our weaknesses. You can gain so much more by developing your strengths even further to be even better, and work with other people who complement those strengths. So if you are, for example, I'll share a personal example. I'm very good with detail. I'm very good at the kind of task level, action taking type of stuff. I'm not so good with the strategic thinking, taking the helicopter view. So if I work with people, so for example, I'll hire a coach to help me with that type of stuff, where they can provide that perspective of the bigger picture strategic thinking, which is not an area of strength of mine. So focusing on building up your strengths and developing your strengths rather than trying to overcome your weaknesses is what I'm trying to say here. Another thing to think of: is your boss or team aware of your strengths? And it probably wasn't until after I left my corporate role that I realized, actually, my boss and team, I don't think we ever talked about each other's strengths, or who would you know, if I wanted to go and speak to Claire, like, what's Claire really good at? what am I really good at? Do they know what I'm really good at? So making sure that other people are actually aware and having those discussions. And I know certainly in the corporate environment, we never really had those discussions. We just never really had those discussions as a team. So they're the kind of thought starters around the strengths. As I said, embedded and hidden are some links that you can use to find out more about your strengths. So maybe we'll take a pause there, Jayson, to see if there's any questions around this area of strengths before we move on to talking about values.
None as yet, Aoife. I suppose it's still very early days. I haven't heard any.
Cool, no worries. And I'd love if people wanted to put in what their strengths actually are. So if you know your strengths, pop them into the chat as well. I'd love to know. So we'll talk about values. And if you had said to me a few years ago, what are your values? And also probably what are your needs? I would have been more aware of what my strengths were than my values or my needs. But if someone had said to me 5 years ago, what are your values? I'd be like, I have no idea. Really, like, I was aware that we had corporate values in the organization, but those values were pretty meaningless, if I'm honest. I didn't really make the connection between my own personal values and the values of the organization. But if you don't know what your values are, here are some ways to think about what they are and how to discover what your values are. So think about, what do you make additional time for? So for me, I like to make things easy for people. So I will go out of my way and spend extra time setting up things in a systemized way so that when someone comes to work with me, that they can do everything quite seamlessly. Like, I'll give an example of the podcast. I've set up all systems in place. I have ways to capture everything on Google Forms. For me, that kind of shows that I like to be organized and structured, but I also like to minimize waste. I don't like to waste people's time. And I like to have everything done in a very efficient and productive way. So they're the kind of things I will invest additional time to ensure that things like that happen. Another way to understand what your values are is thinking about, where do you spend your time, money, or energy? For me, I spend an awful lot of time, money, and energy on personal development. So whether it's reading books or buying books or taking courses or investing in coaching, all of that kind of stuff, I have absolutely no problem investing in those kind of things, because it's something that is really, really important to me, is development, growing myself. So that's something that I highly value. And then another way to think about your values are thinking about what really annoys you. So if there's something in particular that bothers you a lot, then the opposite of that thing is probably something that you hold as a value, because it becomes almost intolerable when someone else does that thing that really annoys you. And if I think of some examples from a personal perspective, I know from when I used to share houses with other people, when I used to live with other people and they'd leave kind of a mess, it was like probably hitting on a few different of my values. The need or the value of having order and structure was one, but also like a value of respect and how you treat other people in a shared space, especially if someone is leaving a mess behind, that shows utter disrespect in my mind. So they are some ways to think about what your values are if you don't already know what your values are. And again, in the chat, I'd love to know, have you done any work on your values? Do you know what your top 3 to 5 core values are? And put them in the chat. The other thing to think about when it comes to work is, are my values aligned with those of the organization? And I suppose there's a couple of different ways to think about this. One of those ways is what the organization says they stand for. Is that what they actually stand for? So they say that the values are this, and they're not behaving in that way whatsoever. So that they say one thing, but they're actually not the lived values in the organization. That's not really how people are behaving in that organization. The other thing is to think about whether your organization has any values at all. And if they don't, then why do they not have any? And they will have some default behaviors that people are kind of just become the norm without clearly defining them, but they become the underlying values in the organization. So another thing to think about there. is your organization actually living their values? So that's kind of going back to the point that I just made. So the behavior, how decisions are made, all of those things, are they reflective of what the organization says that they stand for? Are they reflective of the values that the organization says they have? And is that reflected in how people are promoted, how team meetings are run, all of those kind of things? Are values being rewarded and recognized within that organization? So it's really important to show the importance of the values in the organization by demonstrating and rewarding and recognizing people. And I know certainly in the last corporate environment I was, they definitely tried to do that. Now, this was a large global organization that was the most bureaucratic place I think that I've ever worked. And one of their values was simple. And I just thought it's so misaligned with how we did things on a day-to-day basis. And if you wanted to send out a market value, contact someone in the States to get approval for before it went out. Like there was all this crazy bureaucracy associated with it. But equally, from a HR perspective, they were trying because they recognized people on a monthly basis for living the values as well. So they were certainly trying to address those kinds of issues, although it being a global organization, it was quite difficult to do it at a local level. So a couple of thought starters. Have you clearly defined what your values are? So do you personally know what your own values are? Are you living your own values, or are you just going along with others? And that's, to me, is a boundaries issue. So if you're just kind of saying yes, even though you feel like you should be saying no, because it's something that goes against, you get a feeling in your gut, it goes against what you stand for, then that could be an issue that you have with boundaries that needs to be addressed. And that can be a whole other topic. And then lastly, how well do your values align with those of your organization? So do the values that you hold align with the organization that you work in? And I'd love to kind of understand a bit more about that, whether it's at the Q&A at the end or pop it into the chat and let me know. Or the other option is to send Jayson a DM if you want to talk about it anonymously as well. So I suppose to recap on what I've said up to now, and before I talk about need satisfaction, we have the first two elements are strengths and values. And I'm going to talk about need satisfaction now in a minute. So strengths being what you're really good at, what your abilities are, and it tends to be the thing that we focus on most when it comes to promotions, when it comes to job ads, when it comes to applying for jobs. We think most about what our abilities are and what our strengths are, but it's actually the values piece that is crucial to finding that sense of belonging at work. But interestingly, if your needs can be satisfied, and that's what we're going to talk about now, if your needs can be satisfied, then it makes you feel like your values are more aligned with those in the organization. So, needs satisfaction at work. We have 3 needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. These are our 3 basic psychological needs. Everyone has them, they are universal. And I personally would love to do more research to see if there are more needs than just these 3, but these are the 3 that have been defined as everyone has these needs. I will go into a bit more detail on what each of those means and what that looks like when it comes to the workplace. But essentially, autonomy is a sense of choice and control over what you do and how you do it. And if you think about what that means in the workplace, and the case for all of these needs as well, is it can change over time. So, for example, at the start of your career journey, you probably required a lot less autonomy than what you had. You needed someone to tell you what to do a lot more than you wanted the freedom to be able to do whatever it was that you wanted. Relatedness then is all about how you relate to other people, how you get along with other people. But I also like to include within that relatedness piece the importance of how you make the connection between what you do on a day-to-day basis and the impact that that has, whether that's on the end client, the end user within the organization, or how what you do contributes to the overall business goals, the objectives that your team is trying to get, the objectives of the organization, but making a really clear link and connection between those things is important. And then the third element is competence, and that's that feeling of capability, that you are capable of actually doing the job. And we will kind of talk about what too much or too little has in just a second. But they are the three basic psychological needs that are universal. I'll touch on some of the additional needs at the end, but I'm going to go through those three in more detail now. So firstly, taking autonomy, and I've used this kind of image of a seesaw here because, and again, I didn't necessarily include this directly in the research that I did, but I came across this concept in my secondary research when I was looking into the different things, the different contributory factors for fitting in at work and for being happier at work. And the reason I'm using this is we can have too much or we can have too little of these needs. So when we have too little autonomy, it means that there is an issue with micromanagement. And again, I would love to know in the comments that I'm not the only one who's ever had a micromanager. I had a micromanager when I worked in Australia. I was like, I better not give too much away. But when I lived in Australia, I worked with a guy, and he used to go into my calendar and check my calendar and say, oh, it looks like you have nothing on. But I didn't use my calendar to manage my workload. I was using like tasks lists and things like that. So I didn't put it into my calendar. But he was using my calendar saying, oh, it looks like you have no work, and piling more work on me as a result of that, which was just horrendous. Absolutely did not like that at all. So when it comes to autonomy, you can have too little, which is being micromanaged, but you can also have too much autonomy. And that results in having a lack of direction. So it could be that your boss is kind of leaving you to your own devices. He or she is not making that connection for you. They're not providing enough guidance for you to know what it is that you're supposed to be doing. They're kind of, maybe you don't have objectives, or you're not clear, or the goalposts keep changing, so you're not really clear on what it is that you're doing, and you're sort of spinning, or you're not focusing on the right work, or you're going off and doing stuff on your own, and then you find out during your performance review that actually the thing you've been focusing on the whole time has not been the right thing at all. So you can have too much autonomy, or you can have too little autonomy, and the trick is to finding that balance, but also being able to have that conversation and articulate the reason that you feel frustrated at work. So when your needs are not being met at work, that results in a huge sense of frustration, and you're pissed off. So what we want to get to is the equilibrium there. So think about, do you have too much or do you have too little autonomy? Or maybe it's just right. What can we do then to get better autonomy? So having a look at what your objectives are and being really, really clear on what those objectives are. Make a clear plan and then stick to that plan as well. So no moving the goalposts. But also, I think it's really important that as a manager, so if you are a manager of people, that you set really clear expectations for your people. If you have a manager, which I presume if you're an employee that you have a manager, that you ask for direction or clarification if you need it. One thing I'll say is, if there are any entrepreneurs on the call, I'm not sure if there are any entrepreneurs, but I know certainly I've experienced this, that one of the reasons that people set up in business is for that freedom. But when you get that freedom, sometimes you lack that sense of direction, that you could go in any direction. And what you really need to have then is a proper plan and strategy in place. Otherwise, you feel a bit directionless. You have way too much autonomy going on. And the other extreme, obviously, then is being micromanaged, which if you left corporate, that might be what you're trying to get away from. So the second need I'm going to talk about then is relatedness. And that's all about connection and contribution. So finding common ground with your colleagues. And I know during COVID that has been really, really difficult. And I think one of the needs that suffered most during COVID has been that relatedness. I've heard kind of extreme stories of people being, on the one hand, really, really lonely, and then other people having really great stories of connecting with their neighbours at home and finding a much greater sense of community whether that's at home or even going for coffee and chats and things with people who they worked with who lived nearby. So I suppose there's some extreme things going on, but for the most part, what I'm hearing is that COVID resulted in a lot of isolation for people. And staying connected with colleagues, you know, are you going to be going back to work? If you are going back to work, it's likely going to be hybrid, you know, office situation. So having virtual coffee mornings, making sure that people are included, and finding stuff in common with people as well. But also thinking about, do you as an individual understand the role that you are playing in the organization's success? So do you know the role and how you fulfilling what you do on a day-to-day basis results in what the organization achieves? So they are, it's really important to understand that. And even going beyond that, if you don't deal directly with clients, understanding how your role impacts on the end client, because oftentimes, and I was always in commercial roles dealing directly with clients, so I could see the immediate impact that I was able to have on those clients. But some people in the operations team, for example, wouldn't necessarily see that direct impact of the work that they put in and the impact that it had. So I certainly, you know, sometimes, I won't say all the time, but try to make them understand this is the impact that they were able to have on my client. Whether they cared or not, I'm not too sure, but making that relationship for people, I think is really, really important. The third need then is this need for competence. And again, you can have too little. And if you have too little of this need, or if this need for competence is not satisfied enough, you can feel like an imposter. And again, that is something else that I speak about, and I will talk a little bit more about a program that I have in relation to imposter syndrome in a couple of minutes. But you can have this need can be not fulfilled and you can feel like an imposter. But equally then, if you have too much of that competence, you can get this sense of boredom or complacency. You feel like you're overqualified for the role that you have. And, you know, you're not feeling it. So either way, you're not happy. And it's finding that balance of feeling that you're capable of doing the role, but you're also getting that sense of challenge, and you're feeling that sense of like, I can do this, but it's a challenge for me, and I have stuff to learn. And then you're growing, but you also feel capable at the same time. Now, I'll talk about how we can build that as well. So it's through capability and feedback. So if you can build a feedback culture in the organization, and that doesn't necessarily have to come from the top. If you want to get feedback, then ask for feedback. If you want that feedback to be constructive feedback on areas that you can improve, just let someone know. Although I will put a caveat on there saying a lot of people are really terrible at providing feedback. So learning how to give and receive feedback, I think, is really, really important as well. Another way to kind of grow that in that sense of capability is learn something new. And I know for me, I love learning new things. I love trying to figure things out. And, you know, I've been playing around a lot with Google Sheets recently and learning new formulas to put in to kind of systematize my business, which has been really great and a real time saver. But I just love getting stuck in and learning something new. And I do feel that great sense of accomplishment when I've done that then. So is there something new that you could potentially learn, something that could benefit your career? And I know certainly there is a lot of focus on, we call them soft skills, but I don't know why we call them soft skills, but more the people side of things, the people skills rather than the technical skills in business. So there could be an opportunity to learn something there. Another way to build up your sense of competence is to record your accomplishments. So just writing them down. And I was chatting to Jayson earlier in the week, and, you know, I was saying, when I worked in corporate, one of the things I had in my diary every month was like, write down everything you achieved this month, so that when it comes to the end of year review, you have a list of everything that you've achieved over the year. And of course, I'd be like, oh, I'll come back to that next month. I'll come back to that next month. And it comes to the end of the year, and I'm like, what did I achieve this year? So as you are making those accomplishments, actually find a place to write them down and be consistent, whether it's every Friday you do it, or the last Friday of every month, or the last day of every month. Find a system that works for you where you're actually going to do that consistently. But it also builds up your feeling of competence as well. The other thing that you can do is to celebrate your wins. So can you celebrate your wins as a team? What does success look like? And what does a reward look like? And again, that's another way to build up your competence. Some of the other needs that we have, I'm just going to keep an eye. We're okay for time here. But some of the other needs that you have, one of them is the need for reward, and that could be like a reward or recognition. So is that a need that you have? These are unique needs that people have. So not everyone has these needs, but getting a reward, and that could be some sort of like a bonus, or it could be some sort of other recognition. Recognition then can be something as simple as saying thank you. It could be recognition in another way, that you are recognized as living the values in your organization. It could be something like you're recognized in a team meeting or something like that. Learning and development could be another need that someone has. So if that's, I know certainly that's a need of mine. And when I was in my most recent organization, I didn't feel like I was learning anything new. I was learning their proprietary systems, but that's kind of it. Like, I didn't feel like I was really stretching myself to learn something new. I was learning their systems. I knew how to deal with the clients. I knew how to present all of the data, but it was really their own systems that I had to learn. And for me, that I felt a little bit stifled in that role for that reason. Some people have a need for progression. So I think as a society, we kind of built in this need of, like, you want to be seen to be going up the ladder, and maybe have a think about, is that a true need that you have? Or are you happy enough to stay where you are? And what's the underlying reason for that? Self-expression, so having the ability to be yourself at work as well, can be a need. Having a higher purpose, so do you feel like this is a calling for you? Do you feel like you have a purpose? Is this the reason that you do the job, or is there something else that's calling you to do that instead? And stability can be another need for people. So if you want to have a stable income, for example, if you want to be in a permanent pensionable job, as we always call them, and I know because I left several permanent pensionable jobs, and my entire extended family was a little bit freaked out about that. Clearly, stability is not one of my my core needs. And then variety can be another need that people have. So personally, I like routine. I don't mind doing the same thing day in, day out. That is absolutely fine for me. But some people like to have that sense of variety, so they're doing something a little bit different every day. And so think about, like, do you associate with any of these needs that have been identified? The need for achievement or accomplishment then. So that's certainly a big need for me. So if I can accomplish something big, then I just feel this great sense of my needs being satisfied and feeling really, really good. Status then is another one. So that can be a job title. It can be earning a certain amount of money, driving a certain car, getting certain perks in work. So have a think about what your needs are. It's not an exhaustive list, but this is just a kind of a short list of some other needs that you might have over and above autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And the reason that you feel frustrated at work is because one of these needs is not being satisfied. So identifying what need is not being satisfied, and having that discussion, having that awareness, but then having that discussion or taking steps to remedy that situation is going to change how you feel about work. So what we spoke about was all about being happier at work. We talked initially about strengths and how it's important to work to your strengths, know what your strengths are, and be working to those, developing your strengths rather than mitigating your weaknesses. We spoke as well about values and how important it is to make sure your values are aligned with those of the organization, that the organization's values are the lived experience in that organization, and they're not just like something that's just on the wall, and they're not actually doing anything about it, or it's not how decisions are made or how behavior is. We also then spoke about the needs and the importance of having our needs satisfied at work. We talked about autonomy, relatedness, and competence, and how it's not a case of just giving someone a whole load of autonomy. And certainly in the pandemic, overnight, people had a huge amount of autonomy because everyone was sent home to work. So you had all of this time freedom. Now, some people, the stories I've heard about like monitoring and all that kind of stuff, but most people had this great sense of autonomy. But it's not just about having autonomy, it's about finding that balance. So it's not having too much, it's not having too little, it's finding what is just right for you. And that could change throughout your career, and different people will have different needs. So if you're a manager who's managing people, you will need to be aware of the level that they need and be able to hold those difficult conversations when their needs are not being satisfied as well. So before we go on to question time, I do want to talk about this program that I've launched, which is called Imposter to Empowered. It's a 6-week online course with weekly group coaching calls, downloadable tools, and an interactive peer group. So I'm capping it at 6 people taking part in this in the course for the 6 weeks. Any details, again, you will have copies of these slides, so you can click straight into it. But if you want to check out more in advance of getting those slides, you can go to impostersyndrome.ie/imposter to empowered. All one word. If you want to know more about that. And we'll be looking at things like what is imposter syndrome, how it gets in our way, how it shows up, what are the emotions and behaviors around imposter syndrome, and crucially, what are the steps that we can take to manage and overcome imposter syndrome so that we can skyrocket our career, so that we can feel more confident, so that we can earn what we're worth, all of those great things. So I just wanted to shout out to that before we move on to the questions.
Awesome. Aoife, thank you so much. That was really great. I thoroughly enjoyed it personally, and some really nice comments in the chat box as well around it. I've got a couple of questions through direct message.
Yeah.
The first is by Tracy. And Tracy is wondering, could you expand on the need for boundaries and a little bit more around that?
Yeah. So I was talking about that in association with values. So I suppose it's boundaries really are, and I know because I watched Sheila's session earlier today, which was in the last one, and she describes it as it's not quite a rule, but it's just some guidelines over how you behave, how you live your life. But if you think about what your core values are, and if you don't speak up and let someone know that something bothers you, then you can't expect them to know. So you have to, first of all, know what your boundaries are. So you need to know, understand your boundaries are associated with your core values. So knowing clearly what your core values are. So I'll give the example in that I had when I lived with someone who basically left a huge mess all the time when I was living with her. And it really bothered me a lot. And I was so afraid to say something to her. But it got so annoying for me that I just had to say something. And I did. And I was so nervous and I was shaking and everything. But I said it to her. And you get this sense of relief because I communicated what my boundaries are. Like, you can't leave a mess when and I probably did fluff it in that sort of way. But looking back now, I probably should have said something like, from my perspective, this is how I feel. When you leave a mess, I feel like I'm being disrespected. I feel like my need for order and structure is not being met. So what can we do together to support you, to help me to feel better? At the time, it definitely wasn't as easy as that. But understanding what your core values are and then being able to communicate those in an effective way that's how you establish boundaries.
Awesome, thank you. I might have a little addition to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it, Jayson. Yeah.
I suppose when I hear talk around values and to me, it often links very much into personality. And so, if we've got personality being consistent patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving, and I suppose our values seem to be almost the expression of that to an extent. But I suppose one thing I like about personality is, there's some very good personality assessments out there. Do you know of an equivalent, values assessment that's any good? I failed to find one in my life or in.
Interesting you say that, actually, because I'm working on something like that myself, to create a values assessment to help people to understand what their values are. I forgot to mention it when I was talking about values, but it is hidden. If you want to sign up, there's a link there to be the first to hear about what that is. Because I, like you, Jayson, found that, like, how do I figure out what my values are? Like, there isn't anything that I'm aware of that's, like, the only thing I can see is that you do one-to-one work with a coach, or you do extensive work for yourself, and it takes ages. Like, I think when I first started writing down my values, I had like 35 values or something, and I was like, I can't possibly keep track of 35 values. But then I was able to group them together into similar things that were similar to each other. So things like excellence and learning and development and those kind of things, they all sort of interrelate, and maybe I'll give them a different name then, but they're all interrelated. They're all to do with doing my best, and to do with achievement and things like that. So I don't know of anything, but I am creating something to
Awesome.
help people to understand what the values are.
I look forward to checking that out. And I promise that wasn't a loaded question, actually. It's
yeah,
quite
like,
loaded.
Wait a minute.
So I've loads of questions, but I'm going to try to focus on the questions coming in the chat.
Sure.
There's a comment by Carol around imposter syndrome, and she talks a little bit about it. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot now. I know that's not what your presentation talk is about.
Is there anything in particular that you want to know?
Guys, feel free to throw a question in the chat about that if you have anything else. But I suppose even, maybe where does it come from, and maybe why is it so common? Is it something?
Yeah, it's funny, Jayson. The reason I was saying I should have something specific is I could talk about that all day. I've been talking about imposter syndrome. It feels like nonstop for the last 2.5 years or so. And it's something I love talking about. It's something I've experienced multiple times myself. Where does it come? Like 70% of people at some stage in their career, and I can't pinpoint where this research comes from, but that number shows up everywhere. 70% of people at some stage in their career will suffer from imposter syndrome. When you feel you have imposter syndrome, you feel like you're very much alone, and you're afraid to talk about it, and it's a real taboo subject, and you're afraid that you'll expose yourself by saying, listen, I think I have imposter syndrome. Well, then you're like, well, I've just blown my cover completely, and people are definitely going to know I'm an imposter because I've just told them that I am, and they're, the jig is up, as they say. Where does it come from? Like, who knows? It's something probably that's formed in childhood with a lot of people, where, I've done a lot of research around this, where it could be that a parent had high expectations, and therefore you become a bit of a perfectionist. There's 5 different types of imposter, and I think from what I can see from the research I've done, is the most common would be the perfectionist or the soloist. And so the perfectionist is the kind of person who they have extraordinarily high expectations of themselves, but they place those expectations on others as well. And they expect others to live up to those really unrealistically high expectations that they set. Mistakes are unacceptable. They really spend way too much time trying to make things perfect, trying to make sure that there's no typos, all of that kind of thing. Soloists then are the kind of people who prefer to work alone, or not even that they prefer to work alone, but when they get an accomplishment, they want to ensure that that accomplishment is theirs alone. So not only will they not ask for help from other people, if someone offers help, they're very reluctant, or like, not even that they're reluctant, they will say no. They'll say no because they'll feel if they got help with something that they didn't deserve that accomplishment because someone else helped them.
Okay, wow.
So is there anything else that you would like to know about imposter syndrome?
Well, I suppose in terms of, when I've worked with people on it in terms of one-to-one, it would, generally, I mean, a lot of the work I do with people is kind of getting at their underlying beliefs and what's going on underneath the hood a little bit, and I think perfectionism is a big part of
Yeah,
imposter syndrome,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah, totally.
But
Procrastination, overwork. There's loads of ways that it shows up. And yeah, definitely like working longer hours, not speaking up in meetings because you're afraid that people will find out that you've no idea what you're talking about. Being afraid to put yourself forward for opportunities because there's no way that you could get that because you're a fraud as it is. Like there's yeah.
Mm. And sometimes I feel it's almost the most high achieving people and the people who are doing
Yeah.
like mind blowing stuff.
Yeah, totally.
They'll
Yeah.
approach and come and go.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
it's
there's a lot of self doubt there, and
yeah,
they're running a major corporation,
yeah,
and you're like,
yeah.
wow, yeah,
It's this cognitive bias, and you only look for the things that prove what you believe about yourself. So, um, oh, I said the wrong word, or I had a typo, or and that becomes this belief that you have, a reinforcing belief about yourself. You dismiss things that don't align with your beliefs. So if someone says, wow, that was a really great presentation, wow, that was a really great meeting that you ran with the client, wow, you did a really great job on that spreadsheet, wow, you did all of these wonderful things, but we actively choose not to believe that because we would prefer to be right about ourselves rather than listening to the voice of reason, let's say.
yeah, absolutely. Do you mind if I throw another couple questions at you?
Go
Just
for it, Jayson.
cool.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no
I'm
worries.
conscious of your time. You've been very generous already. Um, I suppose this was one that came up earlier around the idea around strengths, and I've come across this research myself, and it's one I can't put my finger on again, but it is this idea that working on your strengths is better, for want of a better word, than
Yeah,
working on your weaknesses.
yeah,
I mean, in terms of where I would come from often with people in terms of growth and development, in my experience, it's
mm,
working on weaknesses is harder. It's not pleasant.
yeah,
It really isn't. But
mm,
in terms of long-term growth, I would
yeah,
argue that it can, so I mean, I'll give you an example. I would
yeah,
have been terrified to ever speak in public, but
yeah,
overcoming that because it was something that didn't come naturally to me at all
yeah.
was it felt very, very rewarding. But any thoughts or any, I suppose, background around that idea that working on your strengths is uh, better or more effective, or I can't remember the paper either, and I
Yeah,
suppose
no, it's such
that's
an
what I'm thinking.
interesting topic, I think, and I suppose I'll come at it from both sides. I believe it's not even that it's one paper. I believe that it's the thoughts, the entire thinking behind positive psychology is focusing on our strengths rather than mitigating our weaknesses. That's what my understanding of it is. Um, and the the reasoning behind it is if you are an 8 out of 10 of something that you're really good at, imagine that you could get, and now I'm putting limits on it, even just thinking about it, saying like, oh, 10 is the highest that you can get, but let's say infinity is the best you can be, and currently you're at an 8, but you can continually grow and get better at that, versus something that you find very difficult to do and you're currently at a 2 or a 3, and you're trying to um, mitigate that weakness in some way, then it's exactly as you said, it becomes more of a struggle. It's, if you focused on doing what you do really well and doing that even better consistently rather than focusing on things that maybe you're not so good at. And I suppose thinking about it, maybe there is that difference between what can be learned. So can you learn the skills to be a public speaker? And I don't think that public speaking comes naturally to anyone. I think that comes from practicing, and maybe in my previous career, because I stood up and delivered presentations to clients all the time, that was part of my job. The difference now is that I'm not talking about data, and I'm not kind of protected by here's a whole load of numbers. Now it's very much the stuff I talk about comes from a personal um, from a place inside me, which makes it very different. And when I first did that, it was so difficult. I was really nervous, and I was like, oh, I don't know how this is going to go down. How are people going to react? So it was a very, very different experience. But maybe there are learned or skills that you can kind of learn a little bit more easily versus like what I'm like my thinking is very in the detail. and I struggle a little bit with that big picture stuff. Now, it's probably better for me to work with someone who is a big picture thinker and me be the detail and task person and work alongside that person rather than me thinking I need to be a picture thinker as well as in the detail, if that makes sense.
I get you. Yeah, completely. I think it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, totally. And
there's so much in it. Yeah.
we could probably talk about it all day. And me being that research and data geek, I would love to continue doing research into all of these different kinds of areas.
Okay, awesome. I have two more for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The last one will be a quickish one, I promise. But this, I'm just wondering. So I suppose just when you were talking about values, and I suppose the one word that kept coming up for me today was purpose. So I suppose in terms of our needs, it's the model that you're pulling from, I guess, as far as I know, is, I don't know how to pronounce Deci and Ryan or Decky and Ryan, but
I think, DC and Ryan, self-determination theory. Yeah.
I've seen it written a million times, but I've never actually.
I know, same. And in my head, it was always Decky. I was like, oh, Decky. But no, I think it's.
Sounds very Irish all of a sudden. But I suppose they've got those three needs, and I suppose I just kept going back to Daniel Pink's book Drive. I don't know if you've ever come across it, but
yeah. And if you ask me what book would I recommend, that is, and that's he uses the same concept, but he gives them different words.
Okay. Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, he talks about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. He doesn't really talk about connection in there. What's your thoughts in terms of like purpose? And I know you talk about having a higher purpose.
Yeah.
Because for me, purpose is about having something important to do, and that can come from external.
Yeah.
You know, if your boss gives you.
And I suppose so there's higher purpose as like a separate need, and maybe not everyone has that sense of higher purpose. But if you kind of mesh Drive and DC and Ryan's research, and this is kind of what I touched on with the relatedness piece. So the relatedness piece is that kind of connection piece and how you relate to other people who you work with, but also how you relate what you do on a day-to-day basis to the bigger picture of what the organization is trying to achieve. And I think what I've neglected to mention when I was talking about it is how you make that, how you relate that to the bigger picture of what you are trying to achieve in your life. So how does this job fit in with what it is that you are trying to achieve? And that relates to the purpose piece.
Okay.
Yeah. In a couple of different ways. So it could be the relatedness of the purpose and the objectives and the goals of the organization, the impact, and this is the really important thing, the impact that you are having on the end user of that. That's really, really important as well. Okay,
awesome, cool. Okay, final question, and this is the one I meant to ask at the very beginning. Books. We love to know.
And I kind of answered already with that. Drive, definitely based on the what I spoke about needs. If you want to understand more about needs, Strengths Finder is a really great book, and there's a quiz that goes along with it as well to help you understand what your strengths are. And then when it comes to values, I recently read a book by an Irish author called Ariel O'Farrell, all about values, and she says values, they're not for the office wall plaque. I think it's something like that. But to me, that was a really great book to understand from an organizational perspective the importance of values and having values embedded in the organization.
Okay. Awesome. I'm sure we can share them. What we're going to do, we'll send people around the video and the slides, and I'm sure we can share those book titles.
I'll add those links to the deck as well, and I'll add some. I have some very specific podcast episodes that people might be interested in relation to fitting in at work and also on values in particular.
Please. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Lots of really nice thanks coming in the chat as well, Aoife, just to let you know. I'm not sure if you can see them. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of practical psychology, in terms of what we're doing. I'm just going to share So maybe I won't. Sorry, I'm
Look, I was
holding
just
it
going to
up.
say, if anyone wants to connect with me, there's my details again. So my website is happywork.ie. You've got my Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I tend to be most active on Instagram and LinkedIn. There's links to my podcast there. I do have a free downloadable Beat the Imposter from Imposter to Empowered 3 Steps to Overcoming Imposter Syndrome, which you will find at impostersyndrome.ie. If you want to find out which kind of imposter you are, you can take the quiz. The link is there. And I will be sharing all of these links after with Jayson anyway. And
Well,
oops, I'm after clicking on that by accident. So I'll go back here. And that's me, John. So if you want to share something, then
yeah, sorry. Well, I was going to say as well, I put a lot of Aoife's links in the chat there as well. And I just wanted to remind everyone about that upcoming event on October 7th as well. If I share my screen, you should be able to see the slide. Yeah, we'd love to see you guys there. Again, it's another free event. It's on at noon on October 12th and in conjunction with Iconic Offices. And they run really nice events as well. So we shall see you all there. I suppose other than that, I'd just like to say thank you, everyone, for coming. And we appreciate your support and your time and your attention, as we said, and we send you the video and all the bits and pieces. And beyond that, we shall bid you adieu. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, especially to Aoife. That was awesome. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the involvement. I mean, it's always great to hear what people are up to and all that kind of stuff. So really appreciate you getting involved.